Hey guys, welcome back to Nadir Audio. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the iFi hip-dac, a portable external DAC amp. So I talked a little bit about the hip-dac in my previous video on the Hi-Fi Man Sundaras here. So if you haven't seen that, I'll include a link in the description below and you can check it out. But it fared very well in a comparison with several other DAC and amp combinations. So in this video, I'm going to be focusing on just comparing it with the one other external DAC amp that I have, which is the FiiO Q1 Mark II here. So in terms of features, they're fairly comparable. They both have a balanced output as well as the regular 1/4 inch output. Let's see, they both have bass boost, although the bass boost on the hip-dac is much better. It's very natural sounding. It's a little bit similar to the bass boost on my PS Audio Sprout 100, whereas the FiiO, the bass boost is not so great, so I tend not to use it, but I don't typically find myself needing to use it in most cases. So I use these with all of my various headphones. In this video, we're still going to be focusing on the Sundaras, because all my sub $100 dynamic headphones can't really compete in a lot of areas. Now I do have some dynamic headphones on the way that are more comparable, so we will be revisiting that in future videos. One other place where they're different is the FiiO is a more powerful amplifier, so it has a low gain and a high gain output, and in high gain it can get very loud. The Sundaras are the only headphones I have that are a little bit hard to drive, and I don't even need to use high gain with the FiiO, whereas the hip-dac has a feature called impedance matching, where it sort of tries to match the impedance of your headphones. I'm not too crazy about it. The only headphones I've had to, or thought I might want to use it with, is the Sundaras, and specifically in some classical pieces and some quiet passages where I just wanted a tiny bit more volume, but in almost all other scenarios it has plenty of volume, so I don't need to use it. But I find that when you turn the impedance matching on, it does a couple of negative things. One is it raises the noise floor, which that's not that big of a deal to me, but it also does kind of negatively affect the sound. The best analogy I can think of is that the sound just feels like it's sort of holding its breath, like the music is holding its breath, and then when you turn it off, it's breathing again. So in general, I tend to want to avoid that. I think if you have a really hard to drive set of headphones, the hip-dac may not be your best option. But in every other area, I do find that the sound quality is better than the Q1. The Q1 I do like a lot. I think it's a great sounding, inexpensive external DAC amp. But the first thing you get is better imaging. You get a wider sound stage, and that's a bigger deal when you're using something like the Sundaras. There's also more just air and space, which is something that I'm pretty focused on and like. I do think that these are both pretty resolving, but I do feel the hip-dac is slightly more highly resolving. It's not at all analytical sounding, but you will hear some little micro details that you might not pick up with the Q1. But another thing that I really like about the hip-dac is that it has, I wouldn't say it's super warm, but there's just a little bit of extra warmth in the mid-range and upper mids that gives it a really nice tone, especially with jazz and horns and some vocals. I feel it really does well. And it also it's a little bit more full-bodied, so if you're listening to piano music, I think it can make a bigger difference. You get a more three-dimensional and a more lifelike presentation from the hip-dac than you do from the Q1. So yeah, let's talk about some of the music that I've been listening to do my comparisons. So I listen to a lot of rock and alternative rock albums. So one of my favorite records from the 80s is Echo and the Bunnymen's Heaven Up Here. And I've talked about this on this channel before. So there is a lot of reverb on this recording, so if you're allergic to reverb, then this may not be for you. But in general, I think it's a really excellent recording, better than your typical recording from the 80s. It's very large, atmospheric, has a big sound stage, there's a really driving rhythm, great drums and bass sounds. And in general, I just think it sounds fantastic, and it's no exception on the hip-dac. It sounded really good, and I really enjoyed listening to it. Now, I listened to a lot of other stuff that is not as great. So one example was Television's Marquee Moon. I really like the music on this album, but I sometimes struggle with the recording. Now, it's not like a modern recording where it's really harsh or over-compressed, but it's just everything is kind of packed together, so there's not natural spacing for the instruments, and it sounds a little brittle, and it's a little uneven in places, and for some systems, like on my main system with my tube amp and my LS50s, I really can't even enjoy listening to this record because I'm just listening to the kind of the faults in the recording. But I feel like the hip-dac is a little bit more forgiving of that kind of stuff. I was able to listen to it, and it didn't sound great, but it was enjoyable, and I wasn't just focusing on the flaws of the music. Now, that wasn't true across the board. I did listen to Sonic Youth's Daydream Nation, which is another album I really liked the music, but that recording is also a challenge, and just even on the hip-dac, I think I was too focused on the flaws of the recording that I really wasn't able to enjoy it. So I did listen to a bunch of jazz. So Ken McAuliffe recently had a video about a proposed 10-album Impulse collection on Impulse Records. And I actually have a lot of Impulse records and CDs, but actually only 2 of mine were overlap with his suggested collection. So one of which was, of course, Coltrane's A Love Supreme. But another one is Sonny Rollins on Impulse. Now, this is a recording, I only have it on CD. I listened to it a lot in the early 2000s, and I bring it out every few years. It is a great recording. And this was a case where that really nice tone of the hip-dac worked great with the horns. They just sounded fantastic and, very live sounding. You get that sort of feeling where you're almost in the room. It's just almost real sounding, which I really enjoyed. And then, of course, you get the nice room and ambient sounds, and you get that nice live recording of a jazz ensemble. So I enjoyed that a lot. So I listened to a few other things. I listened to a lot of classical. Mostly, I've just been listening to some recordings from the recent Chopin competition in Warsaw. So these are not necessarily audiophile recordings, and you are listening to it on YouTube, but they sound pretty good, and it's just piano for most of them, and I felt like the hip-dac did really well. It was getting not just the tone, but kind of the weight and the feel of a real piano, which is one of the measuring sticks I use. Whereas, something like the Q1, it does just fine, but it doesn't quite pick up all those nuances. So I listen to a lot of other stuff, but in general, I really like the hip-dac, and it's my go-to external DAC amp. Now, there are a couple of other drawbacks I didn't mention. One is battery life. It definitely doesn't have as good a battery life as the Q1, and I do find that to recharge it, it takes at least a couple of hours, whereas the Q1 will charge up in just a few minutes or less. So that's one drawback. The other is not such a big deal for me, but if you have hard to drive headphones, I think the hip-dac might not be a great match in terms of synergy, just because it's not a super powerful amp, and at least with the Sundaras, I wasn't crazy about the impedance matching feature. But other than that, it's great. So I keep the FiO as my backup. It's always charged, so if I run out of batteries, I can go charge my hip-dac and still enjoy listening to music on my Q1. It's not a problem. And then one other thing I'll mention is I do think the build quality on the hip-dac is better. It's a little bit larger than the Q1, but it feels heavier. It has a better paint job. I tend to be very hard on these things. I don't know if you can see in the video, but there's lots of scratches, especially in the corners of the FiO Q1, whereas there are some scratches on the hip-dac as well, because I am hard on these things, but it's, in general, holding up better, and I think it will hold up for a long time. One other thing I'll mention is if you do use Apple products, like an iPhone or iPad, you will need the camera adapter, and that's what I use to listen to those devices. And it doesn't come with a cable for that, but it does come with anything else you'd need for just a regular laptop or, a Android phone or something like that. So yeah, I think that's it for this one, guys. But yeah, stay tuned. I will talk to you guys in the next video. Thank you.